I'm Danielle Smith. I'm guest hosting for Common Sense Calgary. We're doing a series of interviews with candidates for Calgary City Council, and joining us now as a candidate for Ward 1, Jacob McGregor. Jacob, thanks so much for being with us today.
No problem. Absolutely glad to be here.
So let's begin, I think, by just let me try this again. Let me begin by asking you the question about what brought you to decide that this is the time and this is the place and this is the reason why you want to run for city council.
Well, I've always been an advocate for those with disabilities. I've volunteered throughout the disability community, as well as with the advisory committee on accessibility with the city. But at the same time, I've noticed that I'm not really feeling listened to by the city council, or quite frankly, by our current councillor. So I thought, why not throw my name into the ring?
How does Calgary do from an accessibility point of view? What's been your experience?
Calgary's very much a mixed bag. Some parts of the city I find are incredibly accessible, and then some are woefully inaccessible. And then there's some nuance to that, wherein a few years ago I actually applied for an internship at the Manning Center and couldn't be involved because the building they had was a heritage building and it was not accessible. So
what do you think needs to be done on that? I mean, I think it is challenging because there are a lot of buildings that can't easily be modified. But do you think that there is more that can be done to encourage that? Do you think there should be mandates? What kind of approach do you propose taking?
Well, obviously, as somebody with a disability, I would love to see every building in the city be accessible. But I know that's not really like reality either. What I would love to see is, because in the case I just mentioned, there was a clear plan of how we could make the building accessible, and it was ignored, even though it was very doable. So when you come to the city with clear suggestions on how to improve a building, I wish they would be heard a little more.
What about the services that the city themselves offer for transit, for all the public buildings that they operate? How do you feel they do? Is there more work to be done, or do you think they're a leader?
For the most part, I'm quite happy with transit. Growing up, obviously, there were very few low floor buses, and getting on the train was some kind of hazard, let me tell you. But now the transit fleet seems much more accessible, and I see it as a pretty viable option.
I note that you are passionate about youth sports and passionate about professional sports, passionate about the arts as well. Do you find that you're able to take part in all of those events, or is there an accessibility issue there?
Obviously, facilities like the Saddle Dome, I'm glad they're being replaced, because what passed as accessible and up to code in 1983 isn't really what the standard would be today. So, but as far as in general, I find I have quite a few options, even if the process and the setup is a little antiquated.
Let's stay talking about infrastructure for a bit, because it's a huge ticket item. And so I want to see if you would bring a different lens to some of these issues than other candidates might. So for instance, the city has 4 major infrastructure projects underway: the Event Center with the Calgary Flames, the BMO Center expansion, the Arts Commons transformation. and the Foothills Field House. Do you feel like they are taking the concerns of those who have physical disabilities into account as they're looking at those issues? Have you had some success in your lobbying there?
I feel reasonably heard, because I'm actually also a season ticket holder with the Flames, and their engagement sessions have actually focused a fair bit on accessibility, which I was surprised to see, honestly, because I'm not of the target demographic for 90% of the stadium. But as good as that is to see, though, it's easy to say the right things and then have the results be different. So
And what about the other projects? Has that been a factor, do you know?
I'm a big proponent of the Green Line. Obviously, having more options in terms of transit and where to go is always going to be a plus for me. As far as the field house and arts commons and BMO, I personally haven't been engaged much as somebody with a disability, but I know those efforts are going on.
Let's then talk about the financial side of things, because you, first of all, said you were a proponent and supporter of the Green Line. Do you agree with the current configuration and the current plan? It started off very different than it turned out to be, and it doesn't go as far into the south as it was expected to, or anywhere near as far in the north, and there's a huge amount of money being spent to engineer it downtown. Would you do anything differently?
I actually don't hate the sort of phased approach that's taken shape now, as that's a lot of what we saw with the red and the blue line originally. They started out going a lot less, or the lines were a lot shorter when they first got built. So I don't necessarily see that as a problem. However, because of the budget shortfall the city is in, I'd like to see the project maybe get shelved until we can get our financial house in order, and then be able to build more of the project at the same time.
Then let me ask you a similar question on those other 4 projects, because when those were put forward, even the CFO said that there wasn't money to pay for all of them. Do you is there one or two of them that you think absolutely should go ahead, or do you think that they need to find the way to have all 4 go ahead?
I think with the event center and BMO, we're very close at this point to getting shovels in the ground. So I think those 2 projects in particular, it would be very difficult to actually go back and stop at this point. Whereas Green Line and the field house are in an earlier stage.
So then let's talk about your thoughts on how you do get the fiscal house in order. There's always 2 ways you can approach it. You can try to bring in more revenue, or you can try to cut costs. What do you think the proper emphasis is right now?
I'd like to see a bit of both. If people look at my platform proposals, they'll see I'd like to eliminate supplementary pensions for not just council but administration as well, and do a 10% salary rollback for City Hall employees, including council, which means, and I'll say this on the record right now, even if I can't get something like that done, I will be donating 10% of my
Hmm.
paychecks.
All right. So
Um,
that deals with the revenues. I may as well ask the other question because it sounds like you want to do a lot of work on getting spending under control. There has been proposals in city charter and various other reports that have come forward in the past that propose new revenue generating tools, new taxing powers. Do you think that Calgary needs new taxes?
I don't think it needs new taxes. I think we're asking the wrong question there. I think the question should be, how can we keep everybody's taxes as low as possible while still providing the services everybody expects? So one of the things I'd like to do, and this sort of fits with the current debate with regards to the guidebook for great communities, is in order to battle urban sprawl and fight what's perceived to be overdevelopment, is an increase in the fees for building projects. That would be a 20% increase on projects under $2,000 and an 8% increase on those 25,000 and above.
Talk to me a bit about affordable housing and how you see that debate playing out, because I think that's one of the issues everyone is grappling with, is that when you grow out into a greenfield space and you can have smaller lots, you can have more affordable housing for new families. The other side is if you build up and densify, you've already got all the infrastructure there. So in theory, you should be able to also have more affordability. Just give me your sort of your general outlook on how you create affordable housing.
So I sort of see the value of mixed use neighborhoods in this respect, because if you slap a bunch of up if you upzone a bunch of places, the infrastructure's there is not necessarily designed for that if you look at existing neighborhoods.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd much rather see the upzoning done in new developments and focus on improving existing neighborhoods infrastructure to make them more move-in ready, accessible, and affordable.
What is your sense of how the public is reacting to that guidebook for great communities? Other candidates I've spoken with have said that those who are in single family zoned communities are not happy at all with moving to greater mixed use. Do you have do you side with them, or do you have an argument to counter some of their concerns?
I see their argument, because, as I said, if you poorly implement sweeping policies like this, you tend to have problems. You create problems where not only do you damage the character of a community, but, as I said, these communities built in the 50s weren't necessarily designed for the upgrades or the upzoning we want to do in the guidebook. I think the outrage points to, and this is another thing I'd like to focus on, and that's communication. I didn't know about the guidebook personally until January.
Mm-hmm.
And it's nice to hear that outreach and engagement's been going on for several years, but that doesn't mean people heard about it. And obviously, you're not going to engage everybody with projects like this, but the amount of people that I've talked to where their answer is, what's the guidebook? That's not an acceptable answer for
So
effective engagement.
truly, so you might be saddled with this if you get elected in October, and it sounds like they're prepared to make the decisions on passing it now. Do you think that's an error? Would you propose something different?
I would have liked to see this be an election issue, or at least have have the debate on amendments delayed until after the election so that we can effectively see the results of outreach at the doors and get people's true opinion on this. Because it feels like we're kind of rushing through something that a lot of people clearly see as flawed.
Great point. I want to talk to you a bit more about the role of the administration and council, but I don't want to leave the issue of finances and how you pay for things before we deal with the other side of it, which is the tax side of things. What do you think needs to be the policy or basic approach on residential taxes, on business taxes? There's been a discussion about a tax shift of moving of having the residential community shoulder more of the tax burden because businesses are obviously seeing massive increases and are taxed at a higher rate. But that, of course, is then creating big increases on residences. So how would you balance that?
Well, this is kind of why I mentioned my permit changes, because not only with the changes I cited based on the average cost of permits, you'd put an extra $13 million yearly into the coffer, and with the slight decrease in demand you'd save costs on inspections and things like that, putting less emphasis necessarily on taxes.
All right, let me ask you one more because it has been controversial in the past when the portion of the taxes that the city collects on behalf of the province, that education portion of the property tax, when they guess wrong about what that is going to be and it creates a little bit of tax room, the city has kept that money rather than passing it forward. If that happens in future, what would be your approach? Do you think it should be absorbed so to pay for city priorities, or do you think it should be passed through to taxpayers?
In the situation we're in at the moment, I would say the city needs to absorb the money so that we can deal with the budget shortfall more quickly. However, with that said, once the budget shortfall is under control, I'd like to see these discrepancies, let's call them, passed on to individual taxpayers.
All right. Let's then talk about the role of council versus administration. There are different views about how council should interact with each other and interact with administration. There seems to be a lot of administration taking initiative and coming for final approval to council, versus the other way of looking at it is that council should take a stronger role in driving some of the changes. How do you see it?
I've always been a proponent that the elected officials should be taking more of the initiative as opposed to city bureaucrats, as knowledgeable as they are about the policy outcomes. We didn't we chose the people on council to represent us and for administration to execute that representation, not the other way around.
So one of the issues may be because you're elected as an independent, so you're not elected with a group of people who share the same party. It seems like it's been difficult to have the council come to a consensus on issues. It's been somewhat fractious. I don't know if you would agree with that characterization.
Oh, somewhat, yeah.
Somewhat fractious. So if you were elected, what would you bring to that relationship with council that would allow you to get more of your priorities on the table?
See, having a lot of my experience comes within the volunteer community, and when you're not willing to compromise and be and bring together different solutions based on common ground that you have with somebody else's position, then nothing gets done.
Hmm.
In the same way, I think I can work with my colleagues to find more satisfactory positions between mine and theirs, as opposed to the I'm right and you're either misinformed or just not looking out for your constituents, which seems to be the environment right now.
You are running up against Ward Sutherland in Ward 1 if he decides to continue on as the incumbent. I don't know if he's made a public announcement on that yet, but
He did actually. He is. Yeah.
he is. Okay. So how do you what do you think of the job he's done in the last 4 years? Are the things that you've liked that he's done, or are the things that you would have done differently?
It's interesting you mentioned Ward. I actually didn't vote for Ward last time around, and that's because I felt very taken for granted
Hmm.
as a resident of Ward 1. Nobody from Ward's campaign came to my door, nobody called me, and that seems to be a common thread I'm hearing. Some people have had very positive experiences with Councillors Sutherland really taking initiative on their issues, but it hasn't been my experience. And especially when it comes to emergency services like our firefighters, calling them the Mercedes-Benz Fire Department when we have stations that we can barely staff, and firefighters going to calls with trucks that aren't designed to fight a structure fire. I think Ward could definitely be doing better.
All right. Let's talk about a couple of the other issues related to the economy, because I think we what we've seen is that the business model for the city of Calgary was to rely on a lot of those downtown office towers to generate a large amount of their income. And with the vacancy rates being what they are, as I understand it, there's as many as 100 to 140,000 employees that could be accommodated in all that vacant space. That's a lot of new business that would have to be attracted downtown. How do you fix that problem?
I think, as we've started to see, I think a lot of this comes from perhaps trying to attract tech companies. We've started doing that. I was very pleased to see the jobs created in our television and movie industry. I think if we put ourselves in a position where we're making this an attractive place to move again, with low taxes and more accessible, vibrant, safe neighborhoods, then as people continue to move in, the businesses will come with them.
All right. There are different approaches you can take to attracting business. The city had identified $100 million to pay in business supports, direct grants to companies. You've talked about lower taxes. What do you think of paying for direct support to companies?
I don't love it as a long-term way of doing things. I'd much rather see businesses that are already here grow to the point where they can be taking up this office space. I understand the need for grants at the moment with the year we've all lived through, but I don't necessarily see it as a long-term solution.
Okay, let's. I have a bunch of rapid fire questions for you here.
Yep.
So let's begin with snow removal. Was very contentious last year. Was it contentious in your area? And what do you think can be done to do snow removal better in future years?
Well, it's contentious for me all the time, actually, because even when the streets do get plowed, the windrows from the plowing end up against the sidewalk. So people like me end up not being able to cross the street.
You know,
For weeks.
Jacob, I've never understood why Calgary does that because I've been to a lot of different communities, and in Edmonton, they shovel the snow to the center of the road so that it can easily be picked up and transported, and it doesn't.
That's exactly what I would like to see, is something like that, where I'm not like strategically planning my route to places based on which curb cuts are by the snow.
How do you mind just telling us how do you even do that? Because that snow did not get removed very rapidly at all in
Oh,
the residential communities.
and in a lot of the big snow events, I'm stuck if I can't take something like Calgary Transit Access, and I would usually walk somewhere. That errand's getting delayed until I can cross all the streets safely. So,
Well, that would bring it definitely different perspective to discussing it at council. Do you think they budget enough money for it? Is it a money issue? Is it a priority issue? Is it a planning issue?
I don't know if it's a money thing. Actually put quite a bit of money into snow removal as it is. I just don't think these are things we're thinking about. And obviously, for the other issue, we could probably be prioritizing the routes better.
All right, let's talk a bit about the potential for privatization. The Ward Sutherland, I believe, was a champion for allowing for the private sector to do a portion of garbage collection, but there are other areas, golf courses, potentially recycling, maybe even snow removal. How do you feel about allowing more mixed or more private sector delivery of these services?
If it works and we can pay for it, if the outcomes are there, I have no problem with privatization and the market. The issue becomes if the private companies want to start, because they're a money making enterprise, if they want to start spending less money and cutting corners, then you end up with worse outcomes. So I could see it working well with regards to, say, snow removal, perhaps, if we gave them clear direction, or on the garbage collection. But I think there's some union issues when you talk about the golf courses specifically.
All right. Let me ask you about some of the other services. You've already talked about fire. Let's talk about police. There is a movement, and they're calling it defund the police. The notion is to
Hate
take
it.
money. All right, we can move on to our next question. But the notion is to take a portion of the police budget and put it towards other types of services for addiction and mental health and address some of those community issues in a different way? Why do you hate it?
I'm glad we brought up mental health because I'd like to do some things. I'd like a city curated online portal where you can sort by not just the provider but the cost and the availability. This would make it so that Calgarians needed help had a much easier place to start. And I'd like to see a pilot program, possibly with the province, to bring in something akin to the low-income transit pass for mental health services. And these are things I think we can do that have real-world, practical mental health impact without taking money from the police budget.
All right. Let me ask you, have you followed the scrap that the city has had with the province over EMS dispatch? Do you think that is the right battle to fight, or do you think that the dispatch services for paramedics should be centralized?
I think it makes more sense in the case of emergency services to have uncentralized dispatch, because with the central dispatch you end up with what you're going to end up having is longer response times. And I think with a local dispatch you're going to possibly have more cost, but the response and the outcomes will be better.
All right. Let me ask you a couple more questions, because this election is going to have a referendum question associated with it on the issue of fluoride. They had considered putting a referendum question on as well about the lowering of speed limits to 40 kilometers per hour in the residential areas. So let me ask you this. Do you think the council made the right decision by choosing to make a decision on one and send the other one to a referendum? Should they have made the decision on both? Should they have left it to the public to make the decision on both? How would you have voted?
For the fluoride, I'm glad to see that on a ballot. I wouldn't have necessarily taken it out. My mother actually grew up on a farm where they didn't have fluoride in the water, and they had much worse dental outcomes than people that grew up in major cities with fluoridation. As far as the speed limit issue goes, I am glad to see council made a decision on that. People generally, in my experience, especially with the residential speeds, have gone 10 kilometers over anyway. So I see this as more of a bringing the speed limit actually to 50 as opposed to 60. And I think it's something that is well within council's right to make a decision on.
All right. Let me ask you about the public art policy. It's been very controversial. I don't know what your favorite black eye is for the city on that. I think the blue ring is one. The one of our candidates called it the rusty towers being another. So they've tried to find a different approach so that they can have more oversight, more citizen feedback. Do you think that's the right approach, or would you take a different tack when it comes to public art?
I definitely think citizen feedback is the way to go, because you're going to end up with projects that have more definable meaning to more people as opposed to just a meaning to the artist. I I'm glad you brought up the blue ring, because when we were still debating having the Olympics, I was like, well, maybe if we vote yes, we just put the other 4 rings on there, and then it becomes an actual piece.
So it's just the beginning of potentially achieving our Olympic dream. That's hilarious.
Exactly.
All right. Let me just final question to you. What would you, if you had a situation where a decision would benefit your ward, but be in conflict with what was best for the city as a whole, how would you resolve that? How would you vote?
How big a scale are we talking? Because I think that has a lot to do with the decision as well. If it's gonna benefit my ward but have like some disastrous impact on the Bow River that pollutes it like to a permanent degree, that's different than, say, something that'll potentially bring more private sector investment to Ward 1 than downtown. And I think my votes would be different in both of those cases.
Generally speaking, how do you feel that your job is as a representative of your ward versus a representative of the decisions made by council?
Obviously, you're a representative of the people that voted for you first. You have to look at the decisions you're making through that lens. These are the people that hired you. I see this process as one long job interview. So any decision I make would be through that lens. However, you're also a part of a group of 15 making decisions for 1.5 million people. So that can't really leave your decision-making process. But I think my personal view is, as a trustee of the people that hired me first.
All right. Well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
You got it. That is Ward 1 candidate for City Council, Jacob McGregor.